I'm Juliette Oliver, the General Counsel here at the SRA, and thanks to you all for taking the time to attend our virtual symposium focusing on mental health and wellbeing in the profession, and to the City of London Law Society for helping us to organise this event for member firms. There's never been a more important time for this conversation than now, I think, as with a new year we enter into a third lockdown, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by three experts in the field of mental health and wellbeing, all of whom have a wealth of experience and particular expertise working in and with the legal sector. We have Law Care Chief Executive Elizabeth Rimmer, who has more than 15 years experience managing and developing charities in the mental health sector. Nick Bloy, founder of Wellbeing Republic and a former lawyer and HR business partner, and BCLP managing partner Shagan Osentoken, who was Business Person of the Year in the 2020 Black British Business Awards and is a diversity and inclusion advocate. So thank you very much to you for joining, and I'm going to hand over to each of the panelists for some opening thoughts in a moment. And then the idea is that we'll explore some of the issues through a conversation prompted by some pre-prepared and pre-submitted questions. But you, the audience, can get involved by submitting your questions for the panelists via the link in YouTube. And if you look in the YouTube description, there are a few polls for you to vote on, which will help to inform our debate. So please do have a look and fill them out now, as we'll be coming to the answers, I hope, during the session. And I won't be offended if you do that while I'm talking, because before I hand over to the panelists, first a few brief words from me. Because people sometimes ask, why is mental health and wellbeing important to the SRA as a regulator? Well, we of course want to play our part alongside others in helping to make a difference in the sector and in understanding the issues that lawyers face and in supporting individuals to reach their potential and have healthy and productive careers. And put simply, the well-being of lawyers is essential to the ability of the profession to serve the clients, to serve the courts and to serve the public. Healthy workplaces promote a strong, effective and diverse and inclusive profession. And that is a statutory regulatory objective of ours, as well as a positive ethical culture. And I think this question of what it is to have a positive culture is a really important and an interesting one. And it's something that we at the SRA are going to continue to work on over the coming year. And we've got plans to engage with firms, develop guidance on our expectations for firms and some examples of good practice. We also know that people are concerned about what our reaction will be as a regulator when things go wrong. We accept that mistakes happen, that people get into difficulty personally and professionally. And we've been really clear that we'll look at the context and try to understand not just what has happened, but also why. Anecdotally, we have seen a marked increase in health issues raised by those who we're investigating. And last year, as a result, we published some guidance on our approach. It's really important that we handle these matters sensitively, consistently, fairly and proportionately. And we've seen an increase in recent months in the use of tools such as conditions on practice and in regulatory settlement agreements where we do need to take action to address risks. As a profession, we combine roles as lawyers and demanding roles as business leaders, often dealing with high stakes client matters. And we combine that with attributes such as perfectionism that both contribute to stress and also can prevent us from seeking help. And we recognise that where people are having difficulties and they're not addressed, matters can easily spiral out of control. So it's important that people can spot the signs, can take action by asking for help at the earliest opportunity. We've worked with law firms to understand the challenges to disability inclusion, and we published some findings in March last year, along with some examples of good practice. And we also always encourage people to talk to us early if they have health and wellbeing issues which are having an effect on their practice. And we've got some resources on the Your Health, Your Career pages of our website. So if you haven't seen that, do please have a look there, including examples of how we can help and signposting to other sources of support, such as Law Care. So that's perhaps a good point at which to pass on to our first panellist, who is Elizabeth Rimmer, Chief Executive of Law Care. So Elizabeth, over to you. Oh, Elizabeth, you're on mute.
Oh,
Excellent.
Can you hear me now? I thought I'd unmuted that. I was just going to say thanks very much, Juliet, for passing over to me and for having the opportunity to join you for the webinar today. And just echoing what you've been saying, you know, there's never been a more important time than there is now to really think about mental health and well-being in the workplace. And we've just seen through the times of COVID how much higher up the agenda mental health has become for all of us as individuals, but also in our workplaces and also for the wider legal community. And that's what I just want to say a little bit about, is I think it really matters at three levels. I think we can all identify as why, as individuals, good mental health and well-being matters to us. And when we think about that in the context of legal work, you know, for a lawyer, your mind is your greatest asset. So looking after your mind has got to be a priority. And when we think about what legal work requires, concentration, focus, clear thinking, those attributes from our minds need good mental health and well-being to be able to do those to our best ability. So when our mental health and well-being is compromised, our ability to do our best work can be compromised. We're more likely to make poor ethical decisions. We're more likely to make mistakes. And we all know where those sorts of things can lead, and there's been lots of discussion about that. And then when we think about it in the workplace, organizations that have good mental health and well-being supports and programs and have an open culture where these issues are talked about are going to be better able to recruit and retain their staff. They're going to create environments where people who are struggling or have made a mistake are going to feel able to put their hand up and talk about it. And that's where we've really got to get with this agenda, is encouraging lawyers when they're struggling or something's gone wrong to come forward and speak about it. Because by not doing so, that compromises your own mental health, but it potentially can compromise your career, your relationships with with your clients, the reputation of your firm. So that whole competency piece, I think, is a really important part of mental health. And then for the wider legal community, but also the public that we serve, as Juliet has picked up. You know, the reputation of the legal profession, I think, is on the line with this one, is the stories around the culture and practice in law are no longer just in the legal media. The Financial Times, The Guardian, the BBC, they're all running stories around some of the sexual harassment and conduct issues that have been in the law. These are gaining national attention, the long working hours, the sort of perception of what the legal environment is like. We know that the law, there are challenges, but it's a great profession for people to be working in. It's a thriving area for many of us, and we want it to stay that way. Because if you think about it in a sort of global sense, I guess, lawyers every day are working to uphold the rule of law and the administration of justice. It sounds very lofty, but in a way that's the bedrock of civil society. And so a healthy, thriving profession is going to be able to support that. And I think what we want to do in Law Care, we're a charity that support and promote good mental health and well-being. We've been around since 1997, but we want to move that conversation now from not just talking about us as individuals, but really looking about what firms are doing and what we can do as a legal community. How can we bring legal education, legal regulation, and practice together to look at these issues that we're all aware of and drive some change that's going to enable us to have a sustainable, thriving profession, and one where the stigma around mental health and well-being doesn't silence people into not seeking help or coming forward when something's gone wrong. And I think that's what the benefit of these sorts of forums are. There's so much knowledge and experience now out there, and we're all beginning to share it. And by coming together more collectively, I think we can really make a difference.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Yes, absolutely. I love that idea that, you know, we can look together, have a joined up approach, and see how together we can make a difference. Nick, over to you.
Thanks, Juliet. Yeah, again, really pleased to be here today to talk about this super duper important topic. For me, it's probably like Elizabeth and for Shagan for that matter, and you, Juliet, but you know, it's personal. I think many of the mental health advocates out there have got personal experience of this, which is why it matters so much. And you know, we see through the stats, you know, the junior lawyers division, 1 in 2 junior lawyers in 2019 in 1 month were experiencing poor mental health pretty much. I'm hoping that the survey that Law Care has been doing for the last 3-4 months, we won't get the results for another 6, looking at the culture and practice of law, will give us again greater insight into maybe what is driving some of those trends. But with my work that I do with individuals, with groups in law firms, what I see time and time again, it feels like we're playing this game of poker, but everyone's playing with a really bad hand. I bet everyone's calling each other's bluff, so they just keep playing. And invariably, there are no winners, because even the winning hand is a really poor hand. And I just think there's such a much better way of doing this. And it almost reminded me back from a year ago when we were still allowed to go on holiday. I found myself in Marrakesh over New Year's, which was wonderful, with my wife and her sister and her partner, sorry. And we decided on one of the days to go to the Atlas Mountains. And we got the map out. We had a car. We thought, this route looks by far the most well-traveled. It's the boldest on the map. It must be a nice big highway. The route that everyone goes down, essentially. And so we thought, well, that should take us a few hours. Great, let's do that. So we set off. It turned out not to be a particularly major road, but it seemed that most people were taking it. But it was very precarious. Some of the road has been washed away in parts. There's a lot of mud, a lot of gravel, quite dangerous. Great for bragging rights afterwards once we got through alive. But the whole thing was pretty scary as we were going through, because we honestly didn't know if the next turn we were going to come to, whether or not we'd still be on the road, or if the car might have tumbled down the ravine somewhere. On the way back, we thought, oh, we'll take a slightly different road, which actually was much less traveled. But it turned out to be beautiful tarmac the whole way, some beautiful scenery, and took half the time. And for me, that's the analogy that I'd like to make here, is that a lot of the time, most people are just following this major artery that everyone seems to think is the best way, when there might be a much better way, which we can enjoy far better and succeed much better as well. So that's really how I wanted to just kick today off.
That's a really great opener and a great analogy. Shagan, over to you.
I did that even though I've got a huge post-it note that says on mute. Well, thank you for inviting me to join this panel, this really important panel, talking about a very important thing, our mental health, our well-being. I mean, for me, I come at it from a number of perspectives. Nick has already said it's personal for us, I imagine for everybody listening as well. I also bring to it a professional interest, in that I am head of the largest office in BCLP. We have roughly 900 people in the office. It's a vibrant, busy business. And to go to Elizabeth's point, that our minds are our best assets, whether we're lawyers, business advisory colleagues, everyone sees this wonderful gift of reality through their minds. So to me, it's a no-brainer that looking after it is as important as looking after your physical well-being. And you wouldn't go out to play a game of football with a broken ankle, or pay no heed to your broken ankle. So I simply see it on the same basis that you owe it to yourselves and to those you love and work with to maintain a good state of mental well-being. It's personal for me as well, because I have been as a young lawyer, newly qualified. I took on some of those traits that Juliet mentioned. Perfectionism, endless rumination about how I needed to be on my best, at every point of the working day. Wanted to prove myself, and of course I ran myself into the ground, and I was anxious, I was depressed, and this was back in the early 90s, when perhaps mental health wasn't such an open subject as it is now. But I did take it on. I did seek help. I did resort to CBT, and the lessons I learned and the interests which it engendered in me are things which still sustain me today. So with that personal perspective, with my professional hat on as well, and wanting those with whom I work and I'm responsible for to be at their best and feel at their best, and I think that feeling of at your best and your best person is so important to the sustainable life of any business. we can all have the short-term gains of a profitable business, but it is not sustainable without a longer-term perspective. So I have that personal and professional perspective. I also have an intellectual curiosity. I think that our minds are just the most amazing things, and I keep up my own level of intellectual curiosity about learning about psychology. I find time to attend. I've signed up to a course at Birkbeck on psychology, so I find time every Tuesday evening to attend my lectures, and I'm loving it. It's just something I can't speak enough about. So I will stop at that point, and hopefully we'll develop some of those themes as we go through the afternoon. Thank you, Julie.
Thanks, Shagan. That's great to hear. And yes, I'm sure we will develop some of those themes. Some of the things that all three of you have kindly sort of planted some thoughts and some ideas which I think would be really useful to explore. I think before we do so, just a reminder for those who have joined and perhaps those who've joined slightly late about the polls that are in the description section of the underneath the YouTube video. There are three there, and the first poll question is about revealing a mental health problem at work, and whether it will A, improve your career prospects, B, harm your career prospects, or neither improve nor harm your career prospects. I want to get views from you in the audience about what you think revealing a mental health problem at work will do in that respect. So we'll perhaps come back once we've got some responses in to see what you think. But perhaps I can first turn to Elizabeth. There is perhaps a misconception that mental health issues don't affect high-achieving, successful, strong people, and that a mental health problem is a sign of weakness. And I just wondered what your thoughts are on that.
Good question. And I think we've all got to remember that we are human beings first before we're lawyers. And all human beings have mental health as well as physical health. And there's a well-known statistic that 1 in 4 adults at some point in their lives will have a mental health concern. We also know, as Nick has already mentioned, the data from the Junior Lawyers Division. There's a wealth of evidence now, particularly from the United States and growing in other jurisdictions, that lawyers actually have high rates of stress, anxiety, and depression. And so they are not immune to challenges of mental health, and also for some of the reasons that you've already picked up on, Juliet, around the lawyer mindset and the lawyer thinking styles. So perfectionism, Shagan, you mentioned rumination, that overthinking and replaying scenarios in your mind. Lawyers are we're here to solve other people's problems. We don't have any of our own. So when people come to us, they're often putting, for many people, what's a very huge pressing concern to them in their lives in your hands to try and resolve, and you're taking that on board alongside a culture and working practices where there's a long working hours, it's highly competitive, lots of pressure to meet the expectations of clients. Lawyers are held to very high standards of honesty and integrity and professional practice by their regulators. So all of that almost creates a perfect storm for some of the challenges that we see in the law. And actually, I think where we've got to move this conversation is that it's not a sign of weakness to ask for help. Because the challenge is in law that the stigma silences people. It stops them from coming forward for that fear that if I speak up about this, it'll be a career limiting step. I'll be seen as weak or not as good as my colleagues, particularly for younger and junior lawyers where there's so much competition to get your foot in the door that you don't want to do anything that's going to compromise your career prospects at the firm. I think where we've got to get to is helping people recognize that asking for help is not a sign of weakness, but before that is actually, and perhaps, picking up on Shagan's point, greater education around psychology and how our minds work would really help us understand that our minds need looking after. We need to know the signs. We need to put things in place to keep our minds in their best place. So, these issues affect all of us, and nobody's immune from them. And the most important thing is to be equipped to recognize and understand and take those steps, but also find time in your life to do the things that support your mental health and well-being. And high achieving, driven people tend to prioritize work over other aspects of their lives. And actually, we need to recognize that time out with your family, switching off from your email, going on holiday, not working till midnight, those are actually things that are going to give your mind a chance to recuperate, and you're going to be better when you come into work the next day for having had that break. You're going to be better able to solve that problem, meet your clients' needs, and get on with your legal work. But we haven't quite got there in recognizing we undervalue that sort of activity. We don't see it as important enough. So yeah, my answer to that is we're all susceptible, and many lawyers are, particularly because of the culture and practice of law. And Nick's already mentioned it. The last day for our survey at Law Care, Life in the Law, is today. If you Google Life in the Law, you can, on our website, it'll come up. This is your chance to share your experiences and help us shape what the future conversation is around mental health and well-being. I thought I'd just get that shameless plug in now before I forget. So thanks.
Thanks for that plug. No problem with that at all. And just on that point about recognizing the issues, I wanted to turn to you, Nick, because it can perhaps be difficult to recognize a mental health issue, and I just wondered if you had any insights into the signs that we should look out for, in ourselves or also perhaps in colleagues.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously this is my bread and butter these days in terms of trying to upskill leaders to recognize these signs, but also helping individuals to recognize the signs in themselves. Quite frankly, if I think back 10 years ago, I had no idea what to look for in myself or in others. And it can be quite tough, but actually there are some pretty obvious things there as well that if we all just learn about them, it would become blatantly obvious where people may be struggling. I think the biggest thing the easiest and first step to look for is for change. What kind of change is happening in individuals? So are they looking more withdrawn, for example, or are they becoming more, they're delivering things late, and that's out of character for that particular individual. But I think where it can be a bit more challenging with ourselves is some of that change can be quite gradual. And so it might be a lot harder to spot, a sudden change overnight. It might just be a gradual building over time of more negative rumination, as we've already talked about, or feeling more on edge, more anxious, more easily to overwhelm. It might be that our self-esteem, our self-confidence slowly starts to erode. So we start to question ourselves all the time and become highly anxious. And that then, of course, might impact our sleep and our ability to get a good night's slumber as well. And also lead to then overwork as well. So another obvious sign of potential mental ill health is where, especially when we've got people with perfectionist tendencies, this desire to always be on and always prove that we're good enough. And therefore we don't leave enough time to rest and recover, and that just exacerbates the situation over time. And then I think one thing that we're seeing at the moment, which is coming through very clearly through the work that I'm doing, is exhaustion, mental exhaustion. The COVID pandemic has taken very much a toll on people's mental health. I think there are various drivers of that, but certainly we're seeing some of the outputs of that around burnout, and one of those aspects is mental exhaustion. But people are also potentially becoming a little bit more cynical about things, and people really thinking about whether they want to leave the profession because maybe it doesn't feel as supportive as it should be right now. So again, another reason why this conversation is so important, because we don't want to lose these great minds. These are great people, but if you push them too far and too hard for too long, they're going to break.
Thanks, Nick. Absolutely, and I just wondered if I could bring in Shagan at this point, because I'm just really interested in your views about the relationship between diversity and inclusion and well-being, and some of those factors and circumstances that might influence a person's well-being as well.
Thanks, Julia. Yes, it is. The correlation between the two is unmistakable. The drive, not before its time, for greater inclusion and diversity is inextricably linked to how people are made to feel within an organization. Now, I believe that we all have we all bring to our perception of the world our history, our upbringing, our relationships, and in that category, I put in how we perceive other people view us, and we have a tendency to project onto reality our perceptions of how we are welcomed. So, if you are made to feel that you are part of an out group and you don't really belong, how you relate in that organization is going to be markedly different to if you were made to feel that you are welcome. This is your place. You are part of an open and welcoming environment. And for me, the culture of a firm in building an inclusive environment is, again, it's not just good business sense, but it is, well, it's not just the right thing to do, because we, as human beings, it is morally right to build inclusive societies. But if you're building a sustainable business, it's got to be one that does not perpetuate behaviors and attitudes that inevitably, to take up Nick's analogy, is forever the bumpy road, treacherous and perilous with steep ravines on each side. That is the road of a non-inclusive environment, and it directly plays into the way people feel about themselves and how they read reality. So that's the link I see between the two. But I recognize, of course, that we all come to reality with our own baggage, if you like, and our race, our identity will always play a part in that. But it's how we are welcomed into organizations that makes a difference to how we feel.
Thanks, Shagan. And news just in on poll 1. So we asked what you thought about revealing a mental health problem at work, and it looks like 14.3% of you thought it might improve your career prospects. And perhaps that goes to something that we've just been talking about on Shagan's point about, openness and the inclusive culture. But 42.9% of you thought it might harm your career prospects. And then the same number, 42.9, thought neither improve nor harm. So that's quite interesting. I mean, it does reflect what I had, suspected, which is that, there are a significant number of us in the profession who feel that speaking out, there's a stigma attached to that, and there are concerns about doing so. I want to move on now just to talk a little bit about the business side of this, and Shagan, you picked up on that a bit in what you've said. The poll 2 is relevant here, so if you haven't already, please have a look at that. And the question in poll 2 is, how much does poor mental health cost UK employers each year? Is it A, 45 million, B, 4.5 billion, or C, 45 billion pounds a year? So obviously, aside from the impact on the business's bottom line, I wonder if I could just ask you, Nick, why should employers take employee wellbeing seriously? What's the business case? What else should they be thinking about in this respect?
Thanks. And yet, I might be a little bit controversial here and say I could very much talk about the moral and ethical reasons for engaging in this, but I actually think we probably do need to speak a little bit more about the why it's important to the bottom line. Because I think we often talk about these big numbers, whether it's 4.5 million or 45 billion, but they're intangible. And I think when I speak to leaders, it's kind of like, yeah, and so what? They can't see how it directly correlates to their business. So I think what we need to do is almost take that step back and then zoom in a little bit closer to the individual and get them to start to understand how might someone's brain not working in the correct way end up impacting not just the individual, but then potentially the work product, the client, the team, the firm as a whole. And for me, a really good analogy around that is, you can be the judge of that in a second, of course, is if you think about the brain as a sponge, and imagine if you've got all of this potential in a bucket, and that's your potential to soak up and to give back and to produce brilliant work for your clients, and also to give to your team and support them in any way, shape, or form. Now, if you don't take much time to soak the sponge in that bucket with all that creativity, all that energy, all of that brilliant work product that you've got, when you turn to squeeze it out, only very small amounts are going to come out. And I think most of us, when we're at work, we've got this very bad habit of thinking, the longer I work, the more productive I am, the more I essentially am able to bill and push out. And invariably what happens is, even if you're well rested, you'll start squeezing that sponge, and by maybe hours 5 or 6, you've exhausted pretty much all of that creativity and energy. You need to recharge. You need to put it back in that bucket to soak everything back up again, to be able to produce again good work, good creativity, and have enough energy to do your work properly. But yet we keep squeezing because it's like little drab that comes out, which doesn't, very little comes out, but we keep pushing and pushing for hours and hours and hours, expecting some miracle to happen. And then they don't leave it long enough to absorb much else. And so you come back the next day exhausted with even less to give and less to give and less to give, and so on and so forth. Until, we're essentially seeing organizations who think they're performing really well, but they're performing really well against other organizations who are equally worn out and exhausted. And so actually it's not a particularly good comparison to be comparing yourself against a profession which is generally fairly exhausted. And that's pretty much what I'm seeing through the work that I do, through the work that the junior lawyer has done, and also I suspect what we'll see through the work that Lawcare has done with their survey. And so I think it's sometimes important to just take that step back and think about realistically, from a neuroscientific level, what's going on in the brain when we're exhausted? How does that impact our ability to deliver good results? And does it make sense that, if I ask a crowd of 40, 50 trainees, do you feel okay to leave on time? And only one person says yes, and everyone else thinks that they have to stay on for the facade of being perceived as being a good worker. Something needs to change, because we know from the science that just doesn't add up.
Indeed, very, very interesting. And I'm sure we can all recognise that analogy is very it's kind of very, very vivid and tangible. I'm sure we can all kind of recognise that. Elizabeth, I mean, from your experience, what can we learn from organisations that do this well, from city firms who seem to be addressing these issues, and perhaps have some examples of good practice here?
Well, I think there's a question in there about who's doing this well, because I don't think we've really got to that point yet. I think most organizations are on the beginning of the journey here of recognizing why this matters, moving away, as Nick has been talking about, that seeing the issues in a bigger picture sense, that it's not just about, originally, we're very much focused on the individual lawyer. You're the problem. You can't manage this work. You're not cut out for the law. And we'll try and fix you, and then we're going to put you back into an organization that functions in exactly the same way that it used to. And now that recognition is coming in, that it's not just about individuals, it's about the environments that we're in and how we all work together, and the culture in law firms. And I think we know from evidence out there across all sectors that the things that compromise people's mental health and work in the workplace really is around their relationships with others and the hours that they work. And that in organizations where you have healthy relationships with colleagues, you feel psychologically safe to talk about your concerns and what's worrying you, those are the organizations that are going to have happy and productive people. I don't think there's been any real analysis yet of some of the programs and activities that organizations have been putting in place. And I think it's great that the conversation has started, and organizations are looking to try and work out how they can address these issues through programs like mental health first aid, bringing in training for their leaders and their managers. But I don't know if there's been, I'm not aware of it yet, any real analysis of what difference that's made. And I think that we've got to go back to basics here. There's perhaps sometimes a tendency to want to buy a solution to a problem. So we'll bring in this consultant, we'll buy you some Fitbits, we'll offer you yoga at lunchtime, we'll do all of these things, and that's it, we're solving the problem. We're not. We've got to get into the culture. If you make people work long hours, you bully them, you harass them, you demean them, you don't give them time off when they need it, you don't cut them some slack, you never, no matter how much else you put in place, you're not going to get to the bottom of the issues here. It's about the culture. So I think on the positive, though, I think by having these sorts of forums, the Junior Lawyers Division has brought out some best practice guidance. There's the Mindful Business Charter, which has been an initiative in the city. These things are all beginning to open up that conversation in a more meaningful way and looking at very practical strategies. So, and I think it's helpful to look at other workplaces as well, particularly in the corporate environment. But I think when you think there are 10,000 law firms in England and Wales, I believe, that's a lot of organizations. And I think many of them probably haven't really embarked on this journey yet. And so we've got a lot of work to do. And I think perhaps coming out of what I was saying at the beginning about law care trying to bring the profession together around this, is that more sharing of great ideas and best practice will help those organizations pick this up and take it forward. But I think fundamentally it's got to come down to culture. And if your culture doesn't support this, it doesn't really matter what else you put in place. It's not really going to make much of a difference. That's in my generalized opinion. But I don't think we've got the data yet to really make an analysis of that.
I think that's a really interesting point. And, just kind of coming in on that, I mean, one of the things that we picked up in the disability inclusion sort of piece and the report that we put out in March that I mentioned earlier is this issue of, I mean, we know that when we go out and we ask firms to, to report on protected characteristics and to sort of, look at workforce diversity, that we have ever increasing numbers of people who are firms that are contributing and participating, and we've had, I think last year was 96% response rate, which is fantastic. But one of the things that that very few firms do is actually use that data and monitor and track it themselves against any sort of specific actions to target, particularly we're looking in the disability sort of space. And so it is perhaps that piece around how are we all learning what works and what doesn't, how are we all actually trying to sort of monitor improvement and change. I just wanted to pick up at this point because a very interesting question came in, which is about the role that the SRA as a regulatory body has in terms of role modelling support and mental health within the profession and in organisations, and sharing experiences and strategies. And I think I absolutely endorse and agree with that. And we do see that we need to walk the walk and put into practice the behaviours that we recommend to the profession for health and well-being, but diversity inclusion across the piece. And we put a lot of resource and initiatives into our workforce diversity. We have a lot of support in place for staff to foster a culture which encourages people to be open. But a couple of those things that you mentioned, Elizabeth, we do. So we have mental health first aiders, some of whom I think are all on the session today. So hello to you. You do a fantastic job. And we know that things like that, and actually also from talking to firms, things like the sort of staff networks, people have reported to us how useful they find having somewhere to go for that kind of confidential discussion and that sort of safe space. We have our own a particular staff network accessibility, which is very very sort of popular, very well, very well sort of used, very well loved in our organisation. So I think some of those things that we do, because we recognise that they really have an impact and people get a lot from them. But I think there is something there for us as well as for the profession about how do we actually monitor what works and what doesn't. I think it's a really good point. I mean, on that point about sort of culture and leadership, we also got a question through last night, which I think is really interesting, which is, do you think enough is being done with regards to supporting mental health and wellbeing in the profession at the highest level within organisations? So I wanted to talk a little bit about leadership, and perhaps come to you first, Shagan. If employer wellbeing is about culture, and not necessarily just the actions we take and the policies, but actually about that sort of wider piece, what role do senior leaders have in driving that culture shift?
Thanks, Juliet. I mean, listening to the results of the poll, I think tell it all. The perception that speaking out about mental health, the potentially damaging career, I mean, that can only come from a sense that the leadership themselves are not open to changing the culture to make it more accepting. So, what role does leaders have to play? Fundamental one. They need to role model. They need to demonstrate through actions and words that they are truly open, truly empathetic, truly vulnerable themselves to mental health and well-being challenges. And they can do that by talking about sharing their own stories. I know there's always a risk of oversharing and disclosing matters which you might feel should not be shared in public. But my own view is that as a leader, you owe it to those you are leading to show that you are just as vulnerable as they are, and that none of us have all the answers, and that mental well-being is accepting those limitations and thriving in spite of them. So I think that leaders need to speak more openly about their own challenges and the fact that and to go to the question that you were asked, how are leaders themselves looked after? I think they need to be open about it. That you will have days where you have just an impossible number of things to do, and you have to accept that you can't do it all. That you are prone and you are vulnerable to bad stress and to those foibles that if not tackled can lead to a spiral. And it's just being honest. I mean, I've spoken openly, mental health network at events about the own challenges I've had. With her permission, I talk about my daughter who was diagnosed with a quite a serious mental health condition as a young teenager, and her challenges and our family's challenges with that. But it is who we are, and by acknowledging that and saying, you know what, it is what it is. This is what it is to be human. We are designed for resilience, really, and we are tested every single day. And it is in those challenges that the virtues come. It's to me it is being honest and alive and thriving in the midst of the daily challenge that life brings. So I think it behoves leaders to speak in those terms and to acknowledge that they will also have to deal with these matters as anybody else.
Indeed, they're not immune from the challenges. And I mean, Nick, I wondered if you had a take on what tools leaders might usefully use to equip them to kind of lead effectively in this area.
Yeah, and also just coming back to that question from a member who did that yesterday evening. But interesting enough, some of the polling that I've been doing with leaders, senior leaders, they don't feel supported. I think the culture that we've created is one which is normally very competitive, even at the highest echelons. So it's sometimes really hard for senior leaders to be open with each other about how they're doing, because there's a real fear that maybe clients will be taken away and what have you. So it doesn't necessarily breed the most caring and supportive culture, which actually the research would suggest is the type of culture you need to get people to thrive. So in coming back to, I guess, to the skills that people need, from a leadership perspective, first of all, self-awareness is critical. We often don't realize, and that then ties into things such as emotional and social intelligence, understanding how our emotions can contaminate a whole team, or even further than that, depending on how big a shadow we cast across an organization, depending if we're a managing partner, all the way down to maybe someone a little bit more junior. But I think really it's giving people an understanding, and I think Shagan and Elizabeth have really touched on this around, the constructs of the mind, how we can operate at our best, and what behaviors do we need to demonstrate to help people feel psychologically safe in order to be themselves, rather than putting up this facade, pretending, as I talked about at the very beginning, this poker face of everyone thinking they're okay, whilst they're all driving towards a precipice, which isn't particularly helpful. So for me, emotional intelligence, social intelligence, self-awareness, key, but also clearly tied into that, courage. And that's not something that grows overnight. We need to give people the support to be courageous, because it's scary to go out there and to be vulnerable and to open up about this stuff when we don't necessarily know what the outcome's going to be from that. So
I just wanted to come back. I think really interesting. I mean, really taken by the language that you and Shagan use about honesty and about courage, and that idea of taking, moving away from that idea of having a poker face or an idea of what is acceptable, and the concern that people might have about, as you said, clients being taken away, and this sort of client facing sort of side of things. We've had a question in on the in the link about the fact that lawyers' work-life balance is somewhat at the mercy of clients' whims and demands, and a very good question prompted about, has the SRA, and perhaps I'd be interested in what others think about others' role in this, talking to industry bodies, highlighting the risks, and Elizabeth, you said very compellingly at the beginning about there is a debate, there is a public sort of discourse really about the culture in the legal profession and the pressures and the sort of a sense of what the environment is like, and perhaps to talk and to improve understanding really with industry bodies and clients around this. But actually the question also prompted the fact that there had been a discussion about whether clients' expectations might be changing in this respect, and whether there might be a sort of misunderstanding amongst us that there is a way to behave, or actually perhaps an opportunity to take that conversation forward about what is sustainable, what our expectations are reasonable, what we can deliver, what that relationship should look like, maybe change the dial. I think that might be quite an interesting area. I wonder if any of you had any thoughts on that.
I can be very, very brief on it, because Elizabeth has already mentioned the Mindful Business Charter, which I think is a really good example or model that perhaps the wider profession and other industries and other clients can think about. I mean, the Mindful Business Charter was born out of discussions between clients and their lawyers, mainly the banks. I think it kicked off with a conversation between a managing director at Barclays and a partner at I think is it Pinson's or Addleshaws. Anyway, it was a conversation around, well, how are your people feeling? What do they do to maintain their mental health? And of course, the conversation goes to, well, we're working for clients, and the client's demands come first, and there was a realization that the interests of the clients and their lawyers are actually coterminous in a sense, because clients want their lawyers to be at their best, and there's no point expecting your lawyers to be at their best if they've been working 72 hours without a break. So the Mindful Business Charter was actually born out of those conversations, and it's a collaborative. BCLP have signed up to it. A number of other law firms have, and it's promoting a dialogue between clients who have already signed up to it and their lawyers, and it revolves around a number of principles: respecting rest periods, mindful meetings, be sensible with your delegation, openness and respect, and they're high-level pillars and principles, and the key will be working out how that actually turns out in practice. But to me, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, about leadership, about awareness, about changing practices. A very small thing I've started doing, which is probably have come to it late because of my, I'm not that technically savvy, but the use of delayed delivery on emails. I think this is just fantastic. So I'm working late, or I'm working at the weekend, and I have an email to send out to the team, I ask myself now, do they actually need to see this at the same time I'm sending it out? And you'd be amazed the number of people who just say, well, I was working at the weekend, so I sent out the email. Well, anyone receiving that email at a weekend, particularly a junior lawyer, is going to think, well, if a partner is sending it out now, it means they want a response. Whereas the truth is, you can do the work, you can send the email, you can delay the delivery until Monday morning, and you've got it out of your inbox, but you're not ruining somebody else's weekend. And so I think your next point about emotional intelligence, social intelligence, just little changes about the way we work and having conversations with your clients about, is this work needed at this particular time, at this rate? In many instances, the answer might be yes, but you'll be amazed the number of times the client will say, you know what, no, as long as it's delivered by so-and-so time, that's fine. But because the conversation has not been had, assumptions are made. And it goes back to having an openness and an honesty and courage to actually say to your client, well, my team has got other commitments. Would this work for you? And be honest about it. And clients actually do welcome that. So I think that's my take on that.
That's very interesting. Thank you for that. So listen, I'm aware we have less than 10 minutes left. We'd be remiss if we didn't come on specifically to talk about what effect COVID has had on all of this, and we'll come on to that in a second. But before doing so, just wanted to report back on poll 2. So 15.8% of you thought that it was £45 million that was the cost per year to the UK of mental health issues. 68.4% of you thought 4.5 billion, and 15.8% of you thought 45 billion. The answer is actually 45 billion. That's from a report published by Deloitte in January of last year. So I thought that was an extraordinary figure, actually. So as I say, yes, coming on to the impact of COVID, poll 3, please do fill this in, because the question is about, has COVID-19 affected how you feel about discussing wellbeing issues openly, and this is something that I think I've certainly had a lot of discussions with colleagues about, and actually how this might have changed the conversation or changed the environment for the conversation. So really interested to hear what you think. But perhaps Elizabeth, I could ask you, have you seen positive things coming from the pandemic? If so, how can we make sure we take advantage of that going forwards?
I think there have been lots of positive things that have come out of COVID. That's not to in any way not recognize the huge impact it's had on all of us in our personal lives and our working lives, and the additional mental load and issues that have arisen from that. But in a positive sense, I think it's been a watershed moment for the workplace, particularly in the law. I think there's probably no going back in some regards to how things were in terms of working practice. I think traditionally law firms have been regarded as organizations that have been less flexible around allowing people to work from home. And what actually happened last March is organizations had to go through a digital transformation overnight. And what they found is they could do it. And actually people stepped up and they carried their teams and their staff with them. And people worked really hard to move to working in new ways and that continuity of service for clients. And I think that's a really positive, that all firms need to be recognizing the additional efforts that their staff went through to try and do that. But I think in another sense, I think it's given us an opportunity to really see each other as more as human beings. You know, we're all broadcasting in here from our homes. We can see Shagan's lovely piano behind him, Nick's nice clock, your picture. You can see behind me. We're getting a little window into each of us as individuals and who we are when we're not at work, when we're not sort of suited and booted and sitting in a meeting room. And I think in a way, that's a way of stripping down some of those barriers. And that when you're talking about bringing your whole self into work and not having to pretend to be somebody that you're not, or putting your poker face on to say, yeah, everything's fine and I'm doing a great job. Actually, the COVID has, for many people, they've had to talk about things that they may not have spoken about before in the workplace. You know, an interesting anecdote from law care is prior to COVID, the most downloaded fact sheet from our website was about sleep. Since COVID, the most downloaded fact sheet is how can I talk about my mental health at work? And there's been a big shift because everybody's had stuff going on for them, from homeschooling to anxiety about their parents. They may have had COVID themselves. They may have been bereaved by COVID. They may be worried about their job. Their partner may have been furloughed. We're all experiencing all these things in real time. And I think people have had to come up and speak about stuff. So I think hanging on to that, the opportunity that it's given us to have more honest and real conversations with colleagues is a real positive. And how we take that forward, I think, is a great opportunity. And we've also seen that one size does not fit all, that we're all different. And so some people have relished the opportunities of working from home and the greater flexibility that brings. Other people don't find that so easy. They feel isolated and disconnected from work. And so I think we're recognizing that we have to perhaps have more tailored approaches to our colleagues and have a menu of opportunities and ways of working and support in practice. And people choose what works for them rather than thinking, here's X, do that, that's going to work, So I think that's what has come out from it. And I think, picking up on the leadership point, I think those organizations that show strong leadership are the ones who've recognized that, because people will remember how they were treated by their colleagues and their bosses during the pandemic. And when we emerge from this, those who felt that they've been well supported and that they've been cut that slack when they needed it, those are the staff who are going to really think this is a great place to work. They really value me. And so I think that's the positive, that chance to be more human, to make better connections despite the having to do it online, and opening up those conversations. And the key now is to keep that moving forward, because I think that's going to help us develop that whole mental health agenda and address the cultural issues that we have in the law.
I think that's really interesting, and there's a question that came in which was about with remote working these days, how do we spot changes in behaviour and how do we have those connections? I think that point you made about having a tailored approach, understanding people's individual needs, the way they work, the way they relate to people, what works for them. I mean, that's got to be part of it, hasn't it? But I wondered if there's any other, if you, Elizabeth, or Nick or Shagan have any other views on that, and also perhaps how you maintain those relationships when we're remote and perhaps people might be feeling lonely and isolated, and some people do retreat in this kind of a situation, don't they? And it might be harder to reach them.
I think you've got to proactively, if you're in a leadership or management role, if you see people hiding on Teams or Zoom, they've got their cameras switched off, and we've certainly been having people mentioning that to me. I think you've got to be perhaps a bit more vigilant of looking out for signs that somebody might be struggling, and not just taking at face value. If you ask them, are you all right? And they go, yeah, I'm fine, and then leaving that as a conversation. You've got to probe a bit deeper and perhaps set up regular check-ins with people that are not about work, that are just about how they're getting on, and fixing a time to do that. And maybe not doing it on Zoom if people have had enough of that, of online, is doing it on the phone. But I think you do have to put in opportunities to connect with people and provide them with opportunities to connect with other colleagues. So some organizations are having tea and coffee sessions. They're having buddying groups for younger lawyers where they buddy with somebody else, and trying to put in a bit of that social connection, because that's what most people miss from the workplace, is the informal social support they get, the chat by the coffee machine, the bumping into somebody on the way in, going out and grabbing a sandwich with somebody, popping your head round someone's door, can I have 5 minutes? They're talking about what you watched on Netflix last night. All of those things are the sort of minutiae, the day-to-day micro interactions that we have, but they support our mental health and well-being because we're social animals and we like interacting with other people, and people miss that contact. So it's trying to be creative about how you can create some of that in an online world. But I think most importantly is proactive, active checking in with people and not taking no for an answer or ignoring signs that someone's not really connected and joining in, that's a sign you need to take action.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Listen, I see that we're butting up against the end of our time. I wanted to come back on that third poll because I think it's really interesting. 75% of you feel more comfortable talking openly. 10% of you feel less comfortable. I mean, that goes to that point, which is that people are individuals, and we've really got to understand where they are in this space. No change, 15%. But anyway, I thought that was quite an interesting, interesting reflection and temperature check that we've taken there. I think before I wrap up, I did want to give everybody a chance. All panelists, please, a takeaway point. If you're going to ask people to take one thing away from this session, what might it be? Unfortunately, we haven't got much time, so brief. A word or a phrase or a thought for them to go away with. Perhaps I could go, Shagan, to you first.
There's a quote I always bring up when I'm feeling a little bit out of sorts, which is, "All is as thinking makes it so."
Very good. Nick, how about you?
I think just don't suffer in silence. I've met way too many people, 10, 15 years PQE who've been suffering all of this time, anxiety, imposter syndrome. There's help, there's ways to get through this and completely shift the way that you do the work that you do and enjoy it. So yeah, just reach out for help and don't be afraid.
Thank you. And Elizabeth?
That I would echo what Nick has said, is if you are feeling anxious and worried about things, reach out for help. Have a look at our Law Care website. We also we have a helpline and support services, but talk to your colleagues. People are frightened of speaking about what's going on for them, but when people do speak up, what they find is they tend to get a very empathetic response, and people do support them, and organizations do want to help and support people, because ultimately, like our minds are our greatest assets, for organizations, your people are your greatest assets. And so don't be frightened about coming forward, because everybody's experiencing some difficulties at the moment. You won't be the only person.
Thank you very much. I want to do a last plug there as well for the Law Care survey. So last chance to get involved. So if you do have time, please do take the time to do that. It's been a hugely interesting debate. I feel like we could have gone on for hours. We know that there's often a stigma attached to mental health. We really hope that events like this encourage constructive conversations and actions, and can really help to build a healthier profession. So I'd like to just thank the panel ever so much, Elizabeth, Nick and Shagan, for taking the time to join us, for sharing your insights and being so open about your thoughts and your views. And I'd like to thank colleagues, in particular at the CLLS and the SRA, for their work in organising this seminar. Thank you very much. Finally, there's a link to an evaluation form in the YouTube description. Please do give us some feedback. And to everybody who's taken part, thank you for listening and thank you for your questions. And I hope you have a good afternoon.
Thank you.